Hi, good morning, and thank you to everyone who is here today. For the sake of time, I would just like to jump straight into it, moving from the seriousness of where we're going to the gravity of our current situation. And today's session is, or today's panel session right now is on learning from COVID-19 for climate justice politics. And I would like to introduce our three panelists, Nimo Basse of the Health of Mother Earth Foundation, HOMEF, Dorothy Guerrero of the Global Justice Now, and Professor Vishwa Satkar from the Cooperative and Policy Alternative Center, COPAC. I'll be managing time very, very strictly, 10 minutes to each panelist, and I would like to hand over to our first speaker, Nimo Basse. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's to see you. And Dorothy, and thanks for the other panels. I enjoyed listening to the youths as well as to the more technical presentation that we just had. I'll be sharing a few slides, and I hope that would make me faster. Wow, what am I seeing here? Yeah, sure. So, I'll be speaking broadly on lessons from the COVID, how this helps us to understand issues around climate justice. So the lessons actually coincide with the way those who are driving climate change, who are polluting the atmosphere, and who are taking advantage of our miseries with the way they think. So the lessons I see from COVID, number one, is that the virus itself is opportunistic. You hardly hear of anybody actually being attacked by the virus directly. It only takes advantage of people who have underlying health issues. And of course, we in Africa generally, in Nigeria in particular, we are not dealing with the underlying cases. We are still kind of intensifying what weakens our resilience and what enhances our vulnerabilities. So the virus hooks on existing vulnerabilities. And you can see the way it dispenses of workers and the way there's a push towards using citizens as guinea pigs to test new medicines. And most of this testing is done for financial gain, not necessarily to make anybody better. And the virus itself has also intensified gender-based violence, just like climate change does, in terms of having deeper gender-based impacts. And then, of course, the virus itself, what has driven the panic, the response that we see, is a narrative around it. And it's a narrative around climate justice or climate change that makes it possible to continue, for the world to continue as if nothing is going on, whereas we are in a climate emergency. And so, corporations, fossil fuel corporations are cashing, and other corporations are cashing in on the corona. They're the ones benefiting from while people are dying, they are lining up for bailouts, they are consolidating their privileges, the rich are getting richer, and the poor are just getting more wretched. So in other words, the coronavirus helps to entrench a broken system. Just like climate change is reinforced by so much false solutions proposed by those who don't want to really think about it. And the issue of narrative as a driver of inaction in terms of global warming, we also see the same narrative causing panic with regard to coronavirus. In terms of global warming, the major threat for us in Africa is that our leaders tend to think that there's no other way to take the continent to a higher level of human progress or human well-being, except by further exploiting the environmental resources that we have. And if we find leaders saying clearly that Africa must develop all the oil and gas resources, whether anybody likes it or not. They said this at the AU, they've said it at the World Economic Forum. Somebody said that boycotting oil and gas firms in Africa is a misguided course of action. And the Equatorial Guinea Minister of Mines declared that under no circumstances are we going to be apologizing. Anybody out of the continent saying we should not develop these oil and gas fields, that is criminal. I mean, when people speak this way, you know, sometimes it sounds very populist, it sounds interesting to those who believe that fossil fuels provide the basis for for living well, whereas it's actually killing people. But these are the kind of things that our political leaders hear and what they say. When they speak this way, then transitioning from fossil fuel development and energy use becomes extremely difficult. And so I believe that we really need to tackle the imaginaries. We need to change the narrative. And we see the same, this is why late last year, so many countries in Africa announced bidding rounds for oil and gas. And in fact, in Nigeria, we just had the government announcing a call for bids for so-called marginal fields. And there's been responses. The Niger Delta Congress, which is a kind of movement of resisting destruction of the region, has issued a warning that the consequences will not be known if government goes ahead to give out these marginal fields to corporations to exploit. And a number of lawyers and community leaders have also issued a notice saying that they're asking for a determination of the ownership of natural resources in Niger Delta of Nigeria, remediation of the criminally despoiled environment, compensation for damage. They're asking for assurance of safety and of the people before any exploration could go ahead. These are ways of trying to working to block continual dependence on fossil fuels, which is a major driver of global warming. So we're seeing people resisting expansion of fossil fuels as real climate ambassadors. And the group issuing the warning has said they will not issue any further warning, that this is the final warning. They're going to court and they will take other steps. But we're seeing across the continent investments in fossil fuel development, which fly totally against the idea of transitioning away from fossil fuel and going for low carbon or no carbon economic development. There are major investments coming from Mozambique, for example, 22.4 billion worth of liquefied natural gas plant. We have in Nigeria the biggest refinery and petrochemical complex being built by Africa's richest man, Mr. Dangote, and it's built in a place called the Lekki Free. It's actually be treated like a foreign colony, a colony where that may not have direct impact on the economy of the nation. And so we are seeing a situation of the COVID being again showing the same response that we have to global warming. There's been a report showing that even though things are going down, the price of oil were going down, there's still a plan by the industry to double production by 2030, and that is really scary. There was a time at the heat of when the coronavirus narrative was really picking steam that oil price went below zero in the US, and many countries really had serious crisis. Nigeria is still in a crisis because our national budget is predicated on the cost of a barrel of crude oil. And because production of oil per barrel in Nigeria is $60, when the price of oil is below that price, it means that we're running on an empty tank, so to speak. And many countries are in that kind of situation. Now, when we look at the current developed fossil fuel resources in Africa, if we're going to keep to the 1.5 degrees, if we're going to keep to the 1.5 degree temperature increase pathway, then we can't add any new oil or gas or coal field or power plant to what we have right now. And even then, it will be impossible to meet that 1.5 ticket with the existing developments. That if you add new development or just combine everything, then we're totally shooting far above what the Paris Agreement, which we don't lay much stock in anyway, what the Paris Agreement suggested. So now, did the COVID crisis provide emergency breaks? Has it made us think any differently? I say yes and no. First of all, we're forced to stay in one location. So everybody must have had a chance to think about life, think about what is really meaningful and what does it mean to really live well. But the pandemic never shut down the fossil fuel mines and oil wells or gas pits. They never did. They never stopped the oil spills. Rivers, creeks, lakes, and oceans remain privatized because these are utilized by the oil corporations that are waste dump, and they're killing people. From February to April, we had thousands of fish dying and washing up on the shores of the Niger Delta. So the COVID locking people up, and then people being deprived of their basic source of animal protein. So the gas flares continue, higher militarization, just like the fossil fuel industry does, and the cricket system simply rolls on. So what are we going to do? From the lessons we've seen from the COVID, a very direct parallel to the climate crisis and climate crimes. We're still seeing environmental racism at a higher rate. We're seeing neo-colonial ways of thinking and actions. We're seeing higher level, more stark levels of inequalities in terms of who gets what, who does what, who can go where, who's thrown into which isolation center, and who is taking action when people are locked up. Corporations are out free, burning, sending greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, and generally intensifying ecocide. Gender discrimination goes on, ecological climate death, nobody's even talking about it, and nobody is making anything to tackle that. And so we really, this is the opportunity for us to reflect and strategize on really taking radical socioeconomic transformation. And this is why I'm so glad with the Climate Justice Charter, which lays a lot of planks on what really needs to do. And this is where I'm drawing my to do right now, which we're learning from the COVID pandemic in terms of global climate justice. We should strengthen solidarity. I mean, people have learned to live, to come together, to defend themselves. People are, I know that some people have taken opportunities of the lockdowns to increase nationalism and lock the borders even tighter than before, creating more problems for climate refugees. But we really need to strengthen solidarity, reconnect with nature. This has got to be the solution, because what caused the pandemic? Well, either way we look at it, whether it's a zoonosis, or whether it came from bats or pangolins, whether it just came from genetic manipulation, whatever it is because of our interference with biodiversity. And we have to know that we are part of the environment, that we are part of nature, we're not apart from nature. And then we have to redefine we have to own our narrative. What is it that is really important for us? Is the imaginary that helps to build the economic pattern, to build the political pattern, to build responses to climate justice, climate justice, to build responses even to COVID-19. We can't do anything, we can't do better than owning our narrative and telling the story that drives our passion, that builds our future. And of course, we need to take political action by organizing at the grassroots. And we are learning through this lockdown to really do climate action in another way by next same time. These are some of the lessons I believe we've learned from COVID-19. There's a very direct interlocking parallels. That's an oxymoron, interlocking parallels, but they're just the same. The same idea driving climate injustice in the world today, driving the world to the brink. That is what has given rise to COVID-19, and that is what is empowering those who are benefiting from the COVID-19 and those who are suffering from the impacts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Romnimo. And now I would like to pass over to Dorothy Guerrero.
Thank you, and I really appreciate joining this very, very important and symbolic event in a symbolic date, and listening to the earlier panels. I really was amazed at how the youth of South Africa have sharp analysis, linking their activism, their boycotts with the issue of exploitation, and how that exploitation in South Africa have enriched Europe. At this point, when I'm now based in the UK, I'm with Global Justice Now, but I'm originally from the Philippines. Since the George Floyd event in the US, there were also solidarity protests here in the UK. And in the past week, there had all these protest actions targeting statues and toppling down Colton and all the other statues that commemorate the empire, and linking it with the issue of the history where slave traders the fact or the issue that they should not be in anywhere in the center of squares or things like that. So listening to the youth of South Africa, I was saying that there really is a big hope, because if you have young people thinking that way, then the struggle will continue. I would like to focus on the linking the political economy, COVID-19, and climate justice, and also recent history of what were the gains of climate justice in terms also of policy, and putting it in the mainstream, the centerpiece even of policy in the global south. One thing that is significant to put in mind was that in the last 2 to 3 months since COVID-19 was detected, and the number of infections and the death rates unfortunately are continuing to rise, there was an almost uniform measures from government to shift their the attention nationally and globally to the pandemic, to the COVID-19 pandemic, and put the climate issue on the back burner, and without considering that the pandemic actually happened on top of the climate emergency. The climate emergency is already impacting lives, livelihoods, and territories, and especially in the global south. So putting COVID-19 without looking or linking it, as what Nemo had mentioned, to the problem of the relationship between human and nature will bring us more, or it will become more problematic, as even if the pandemic will be, even if there will be a vaccine or solution to COVID-19, we still need to find a more sustainable and appropriate solution to the climate crisis. So if we would look at the impacts of the coronavirus pandemic globally, and especially to the global south, what we would see is that even if we're not yet sure how long the pandemic will be around, many of the trends and analysis says that it will still be around for until next year, until a vaccine and a medicine for it will come around. But what is already certain is that the economic impacts of the global coronavirus pandemic will be bigger than anything that we have experienced in living memory. It will be much bigger than the 2008 the 2008 global financial crisis, much bigger than the last World War, and also even it will be more severe than the Great Depression in the 1930s. The different levels of quarantine measures that were put in place in various countries at different level of intensity. Some countries would have the toughest measure, and many governments militarizing those measures have resulted to several things that have severe economic impacts. The fall in trade would be one thing, the cessation of exports that are outside those deemed as essential goods. There is an almost total disruption of the global supply chain of production. And that collapses both the demand and supply of goods, which affected the economic forecast of developing countries. Even the World Trade Organization figures are looking green, that in their measures, even if the lockdown is lifted in early summer this year, there would still be a fall anywhere between 13 to 32% of trade in 2020. And if there will be a second wave, then we will talk about more green measures. So this fall in trade, and at the same time the slowing down of economic activities with people not being able to work, the World Bank was also saying that in their warnings, they say 60 million people will be pushed into extreme poverty in the global south, and the growth will shrink, although we don't believe in growth, but in their measure, it will shrink by 5% this year as nations deal with the pandemic. But what is also quite interesting is how rich countries, or how the highly industrialized countries dealt with it. Many times before, these governments who are powerful in the international financial institutions, in dictating to the global south how we run our economy, interestingly, they did what they told us not to do. So there were a lot of those sort of measures and stimulus package in the economy, or put into the economy. But one consideration there is because they can. For the US, they were able to give a big stimulus package because they happen to be the dollar is the foundation of the global economy. Countries like the UK, I think they put 5% of the GDP so far, in those stimulus package. Germany, also Japan is so far the highest. They put 20% of the GDP in those stimulus package. So the understanding now that when push comes to shove and it's necessary, because our needs will always be bigger than the capacity of institutions, governments could bend the rules. There is a monetary, after all. They can put money in the economy when it's needed. And that is very special, or very important to remember, that government can be flexible when it comes to addressing a severe crisis. There is also a change in attitudes to public health because, again, in the past, international financial institutions are telling us that we have to tighten our belt so that we can have more money to pay our foreign debt. So that's also one fight that we still have to win in the long run, how to cancel the debts of developing countries. So now, I will want to segue into the ongoing protests, because part of what is happening, especially in the US, this big protest that started with the death of another black man in the hands of the police, and while it's still hot and the country is still aflame, another black man died in the custody of the police in the last few days. Part of this protest, if we see, could also be attributed to the failure of the US government to address COVID-19. The almost catastrophic economic measures, although they put a big stimulus package, it all goes to business. It all goes to big capital, while for workers, millions of people are applying now for unemployment benefit. But in terms of who's benefiting, it's still business. And one thing that we could see now is that at this point, what seems to be quite dramatic is how resistance is growing. And then also the lesson that for many things that were being pushed on the policy level for years, it seems that at this time, resistance is building and showing what can be done in a matter of days that advocacy or lobbying could not do. And we have seen that here in the UK with those statutes that are being reviewed by various local councils. For years, many anti-racist and solidarity movements had been clamoring for the toppling of those or for the removal of those statutes. But it seems that several days of protests made many councils, the government, quite alarmed where the protest will go. My last point would be, given that South Africa is venturing in this very exciting process of or building the climate justice charter, and you are doing a very democratic process of that, from very grassroots to series of these kinds of discussions, it would be helpful as well to look at the recent examples. If we remember in the wave, the pink state wave in Latin America, we have both Ecuador and Bolivia that put the rights of Mother Earth in their constitutions. And this is also at the height of the power of leftist governments in the continent. But at the same time, despite having a progressive government and despite putting the climate or environmental justice at the centerpiece of, I mean, it's in the constitution, we have seen how there is also a failure in making climate justice a reality. And part of that is because capital is simply strong. That despite a strong left government, it did not stop extractivism in both countries. It did, and that shows as well the need for us to address both the political centers of political power, that sometimes it's not enough to put laudable measures, the best policy. A step needed there also is, how will we make it actually happen? How do we realize that the governance and succeeding policies will actually follow what is in the constitution or what is in the mainstream, the centerpiece of policy making? And I think that will be answered by vigilance, that will be answered by how prepared are the movements in terms of pushing, and at the same time, when government is not listening, pushing the government. I was struck by what was mentioned by one of the youth panelists, that because I agree with that, we should end the thinking that, you know, capital also have children. You know, capitalism and big business also have the future of their children to think of. I mean, they are aware that they are doing exploitation, and that exploitation is destructive, but they are doing it anyway because that benefits them. So how do we make those who are benefiting from their exploitation stop? So how do we make them stop? And at the same time, how do we discipline capital? How do we make capital follow policy? I think I will end there, and I'm looking forward to the exchanges later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorothy. Now we can move over to Prof. Vishwas.
Yeah, it's great to share this panel with Nemo and Dorothy, and I'm actually going to build on some of the points they've made. I'll probably make about 3 or 4 points given the time. Nemo mentioned how COVID-19 is, if you like, reinforcing a broken system. And Dorothy mentioned how sort of climate is placed on the back burner, while at the same time, the economic crunch and the squeeze is going to be tougher and harder. And I fully agree with them. I mean, I think what we've been living through because of how COVID-19 has been placed centrally in our lives as an emergency and so on, is almost, if you like, living with one dimension of a multiple crisis, okay? This is very, very important. The economy globally was slowing down even before COVID-19. We haven't had a full recovery, even in trade terms, etc., from circa 2007, 2009. The financialized bubble has been building up over this period as well. If you look at climate shocks that have been registering, I mean, there were about 40 tornadoes that hit into the US during Easter weekend. We've had flooding in parts of Kenya. We've had serious wildfires in the Netherlands. We've had Cyclone Amphan and so on in West Bengal and places like that. The climate crisis and its shocks has not stopped. And so we are basically living through a moment, and I think COVID-19 accentuates this, of synchronous shocks on our societies, and that are pushing them to limits. And this, for me, takes us beyond, if you like, or puts us post-shock doctrine, because the hard realities, the underbelly of the system is really, really now in the lived experience of people. The inequalities, the racialized, gendered inequalities, the ecological destruction, the exclusion, all of this is here. It's living this reality more and more. At the same time, I don't think we also about Bendel's, it's the end of capitalist civilization. We've got about 9 major tipping points flashing out of 15, and that in the end, it's going to be climate heating that's going to take us to collapse. Actually, the point I want to register here is that we are living through a moment of world history and capitalism where its systemic crises tendencies are all getting accentuated. The more you do financialize capitalism, the more you have carbon extraction, the more we're going to have these crisis tendencies accentuated. Biological disasters are going to be here and they're going to get worse, etc., etc. So the point is this, is that we need a conception, a theory of systemic crises, and, if you like, transformative regeneration, to pick up on a theme that came from the previous panel. We need to recognize that systems are going to fail, and they're already failing. Our food system crashed many times over this drought that we've been going through. We can't wait for 3-4 degrees to see this crash. It's already happened. We have seen our water systems go into crisis, etc. So we really need to have a conception of collapse and transformative regeneration, so we don't build the old as the systems collapse, but we actually start building the new. And it's the same with COVID. How do we build an inclusive, just healthcare system, and so on, coming out of this? So I really think that this is crucial for how we should think about movement building strategies and so on. The other point I want to register is that, globally now, certain scientists have become household names. Fauci, everybody knows Fauci from the US. In South Africa, we know Abdul Karim, we know Professor Gray, and the science of COVID-19, the epidemiology, the virology, all of this has become part of mainstream discourse. And this is also impacted on even eco-fascist countries like the US, like Brazil, who are not really serious about all of this, but the citizens of those countries have been latching onto the science, have been grabbing onto the scientific arguments and pushing back. In our own country, sort of epidemiological neoliberalism, a government that has not had a proportionate response to the crisis in terms of socioeconomic measures, but nonetheless, it's taken the science seriously. But you also have other countries that have also grappled with the science, and they've tried to get the balance right between the health emergency, human rights, and socioeconomic mitigation. But the bottom line is this, is that if we can take the science seriously to rise to the challenge of COVID-19, why aren't we taking the climate science seriously to grapple with the climate problem? Now, for me, in a sense, the COVID-19 moment gives us the opportunity to place climate science front and center. And I think that is why we invited our climate scientists to work with us throughout this process and to put out the document they've surfaced today. We'll be taking that document to Parliament. The third quick point I want to make relates to the commons. I think there's a lot of strategic space for activism from below. And the commons is really about people democratically controlling life-enhancing resources. In the context of COVID-19, one of the big emphases we've put on is unlocking the commons. And it's really great to see newsreaders and politicians and even activists buzz with this idea of unlocking the commons. Because the commons in South Africa is very, very important for the social reproduction of people. So we've been putting a lot of emphasis on small-scale fishers in South Africa and giving them their rights to fish. And Des will say more about how far we've come with that struggle. We've been putting a lot of emphasis on informal traders. So they who have locational advantages, 70% of poor households shop from them, to give them their rights and recognition. To also get small-scale producers and gardeners, etc., also, if you like, recognized and given their rights in the situation. But the point here is that we've been really trying to construct a partnership, not a public-private partnership, but a public commons partnership through the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign. And this is very, very crucial to ensure that we lay the basis for a different kind of food system and a different kind of water system, both now and as we go forward. And I think that this is a crucial, if you like, strategic emphasis. If we get the food system to move in a direction towards an alternative agroecology, food sovereignty system, we get the water commons recognized and taken more seriously, we'll be stronger as a society. My final point is just around this issue of the Green New Deal. So many people are arguing, well, part of the macroeconomic response and recovery, and we've seen it, as Dorothy has said, governments are finding the money, they're pumping stuff in. But the Green New Deal has had a particular articulation in the United States. I mean, Bernie Sanders' version of the Green New Deal is very, very different from Biden's version of the Green New Deal. You know, so Bernie will say no to police brutality. Biden will say, well, shoot them in the leg, okay? So it has different valences, it has different meanings. And I just want to caution in our conversation about importing and making the Green New Deal universal. I really think, and based on what the children were saying this morning, and picking up on the spirit of resistance and the tradition of struggle, we have got to find the alternative in our context, our horizon of struggle, our imagination, and so on. And that's what the Climate Justice Charter is all about. We really have to start thinking in transformative, systemic terms. We have to go beyond a reductionist science. We need an ecological science. We have to go beyond just a narrow economics with crude assumptions, but we have to go towards geopolitical economy. We have to go towards indigenous knowledge. All of these things have to come together in, if you like, a political project. And here I also agree with Dorothy. I mean, looking at the lessons from Bolivia and Ecuador, it's not enough just to have the symbolic victories. The political project has certain requirements, and it's the charter, it's a programmatic orientation, it's thinking through the big macro interventions we have to make, it's thinking movement building, and other questions about state power. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our three panelists. I also think it's very important to note that our three panelists are three activists who have given us three different perspectives on the importance, the need of climate justice as it intersects with our current moment of COVID, from three different geographical locations also across the world. But now I want to move quickly to our questions, and I want to begin with the first question here, which was already answered in the chat, but I want to just elevate this question for anyone who is part of the conversation that hasn't seen it in the chat. And the question is, what are some of the lessons we can learn from the resistance movement against oil extractivism in the Niger Delta that can be shared to South Africa to take on fossil fuel addiction? I think this question was addressed specifically to Nemo.
If I should respond to that, the connection between the environmental degradation and the abuse by the fossil fuel industry in Nigeria and South Africa is very glaring. And we've worked with comrades in South Africa over the years because the struggles are the same, whether it's against coal mining, it's against the refinery in South Durban community, wherever. I mean, it's all the same, the struggle of artisanal fishers. We found that every time the best struggle is from the bottom up, from the grassroots. And if I should give that example, the most successful campaign in Nigeria is the one that has been driven by the Ogoni people. In the early 1990s, Ogoni people started their struggle by drafting a Bill of Rights that they presented to the Nigerian government, making a series of political demands as well as ecological demands, because you cannot separate the two. And then they asked for total recognition about ownership of whatever nature has given to their territory. And that was denied. And the case Sarawiwa, who was the leader of the Ogoni people, was killed in 1995. But before then, the offending oil corporation had been expelled from Ogoni land. That was in 1993. Till date, they still struggling to re-enter the territory. They're not able because the ecological harm done to the territory is so bad that everybody agreed that this needs to be tackled. And if the corporations were to pay their climate debt, to pay their ecological debt, there would have been a just transition a long time ago, because the industry is actually it's not a profit. It's not possible to make profit if you care for the environment or for the people or for the climate. It's just all the subsidies and all the connivance of politicians that has kept the corporations going. So the lessons are clear. You have to create, there must be a divorce. You have to break the unholy matrimony between politicians and fossil fuel industry. That is one. And then people really have to come together. We need to work across borders. This has been a struggle. It's not a thing that people can just work in one location. We need to build broad alliances and broad solidarity across the continent and across the continents of the world.
Thank you for that. Now, my next question, I want to open it up to all three panelists. When this question is, does the exacerbated and more visible crisis of COVID and the lived disastrous consequences of this for ordinary people put us closer to the possibility of mass mobilization for revolution for fundamental structural change? We can begin with Dorothy, Vish, and then back to Nemo.
Thank you. What I see is that the COVID-19 is showing us a lot of lesson, and a part of that is that we could not aspire to go back. We should not go back to normal, because that normal is death for all of us. That normal would mean more exploitation, more extractivism, and doing the same thing. We should not go back to business as usual. But in terms of attitude and what people are seeing now, there's also, I hope, a shift, a long-term shift on how people look at what is important. That family is important, care is important, public services is important, and also how governments react to a crisis like this, and how far they can go. In some countries, for example, in Spain, we have seen the government taking private hospitals for public use. So how many of those examples can be followed in many countries, and how will that be possible? Of course, some of these examples, the examples in Kerala, for example, how the Movimento Sem Terra in Brazil, for example, while Bolsonaro's government is saying that it is a flu, COVID-19 is a flu, MST showed that with their Cuba or educated doctors, they can put their own health system. So it seems that people, in the absence of efficient government, can do something. But of course, there is a question there that government should still do something. And in that aspect, it is also a struggle now. What kind of alternatives, what kind of narratives and ideas will be dominant? And as many speakers, including Naomi Klein in many webinars have mentioned, that what will be picked up are the ideas that are lying around. And I think in my last point on this section is that for the global climate justice movement, we have all those wonderful ideas and strong ideas that we've already put forward. But the challenge of how it will be seen as a must is our next challenge, because as we have seen, Sanders and both Jeremy Corbyn have the best policy and platform, but they did not win even Sanders in his own party, because the party is still limited, and Corbyn lost here. But of course, there are many interpretations of that loss. But what I'm just saying here is that sometimes putting forth a good idea is not enough. What we need is, how do we make how do we create the bigger we? When we say we believe in this, who are we, and how do we multiply that we, so that we can push for our ideals and our platforms and what we see as the world that should happen after this pandemic, and also in the long struggle for climate justice.
Yeah, so I think we just got to put into perspective where the left is before, or was before COVID-19. So we lost a lot of ground in Latin America, and you started to see a tide moving to the right. Of course, you saw in the Arab Spring also a kind of shift to the right. You also saw in the US the rise of Trump and Trumpism as an ideological political project. And in Europe, the extreme right has also been on the march. You've seen a mutation in neoliberalism towards a more authoritarian neoliberalism. So that was there before COVID-19, where the ruling classes in the world understood that they no longer were leading a hegemonic project, a project with legitimacy and acceptance and consent. And so, the regimes of inequality and exclusion that they've built up have really had to be securitized and policed. So that's the first point I want to make, because it is also, if you like, a presence within COVID-19 right now. The ruling class's response could be also to further securitize it. And lockdowns and so on give them, if you like, the alibi or the pretext to deal with this moment. I think the other point to make around this is that, and here I agree with Dorothy, that if we have a theory of systemic crises and transformative regeneration, so the system has vulnerabilities, it has weaknesses. So we're seeing it right now in the context of the food crisis in South Africa and the water crisis. Nothing stops us from stepping up and making the case and the arguments for fundamental systemic alternatives around that. The idea of a universal basic income grant right now is a very, very important idea. The idea of building solidarity economies with cooperatives, etc., for self-provisioning and so on. There's important space right now to shift the balance of forces, to win, if you like, an imaginary that is transformative, that is about deep systemic transformation. And I think that's the space we have. And I think this is where the Climate Justice Charter, its narrative and its emphasis is very, very important. We can take society in this moment to a place where it believes and it wants more fundamental transformation.
All right, thank you. I copy and paste all you both have said. I hope that's okay. I want to comment on, in addition to all this, that the political power structure in the world has very deliberately always moved in the opposite direction of justice. And this can be seen in the way the Conference of Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change has been going, even from Kyoto, and of course taking a major turn in Copenhagen in 2009, and then finally becoming a voluntary instrument at Paris, and which the world celebrated because there was no longer any real sense of responsibility for any country. But to me, the whole struggle for climate justice took a major, the highest point we got to, or let me say a high point, maybe not the highest, but a very significant point was in 2010 during the People's Summit in Cochabamba, Bolivia, which gave birth to the draft declaration of the rights of Mother Earth, the rights of nature, which eventually made its way into Ecuador's constitution, Bolivian constitution, and maybe mentioned also in, I'm not sure if it was mentioned in Venezuela. But this was very instructive that people could meet over a short period of time and get to real conclusions that nature has a right to maintain its cycles, that we have to live in harmony within ecosystem limits, and that we have to recognize climate debt, something that we owe and something that the polluting nations have refused even to consider, even to talk about. They won't even talk about it. And then, of course, the issue of how to fund pay for climate loss and damage, as well as building resilience and adaptation. It's clear that the Green Climate Fund would not do it. but this can be done through a demand for climate debt payment. It could be also a demand to just call the world back to the narrative of war. Why is the world investing so much in destruction? Over $2 trillion US every year in military hardware and needless destruction, when we should be building solidarity and building our connection back to nature. So the whole thing comes to our thinking. We have to regain our imaginary to find our way back to nature, that we are stronger together. That's not a cliche, it's a truth. And that's stronger together, not just human beings to other human beings, but human beings and Mother Earth. Human beings and the smallest microorganism. Just like the virus is disciplining us, we should know that small things are important. So we really need to rethink about the logic of power and the logic of the essence of what is real. What is it that's so important? I've been restricted for the past 3 months, and I learned to start. I started a garden. Something I would have loved to do a long time ago. I started a garden in my home, and every morning I go to talk to the plants. I see a lot of insects. I see snails. I see a lot of things that I never knew were around me before. And this builds for me a closer connection to nature. And I think we can do this on a wider level, not just romantically, but as something that really tells us who we are, that we came from the soil, and one day, if you are lucky, you go back to fertilize the soil. So why the damage and how the destruction?
Thank you very much for that. Because of time, I'm going to take just one final round of questions, and I'm just going to list a couple of questions, and the panelists can just answer briefly what their thoughts are with regards to the question that they feel pertains to their understanding of the issues. The first one is, how can money be used to serve climate justice, not capitalist profit, as a tool, to serve climate justice and not just for capitalist profit maximization? Another question is around internationalism and how we can foster internationalism during this period. And then the final question I will ask, in the interest of time, is, what do you see as a priority area for the rights of nature, and does this include an earth jurisprudence? I would actually, let me continue again in the same order we just did, of Dorothy, Prof. Vishwas, and then Nemo.
Yeah, I will go back to that point that some policies that used to be thought of as not possible is now becoming possible, like widening the budget for public services, providing basic services massively to address the crisis. I think part of these responses to COVID-19 in the long term can be permanent, because if people will insist or will push that if this happen now, then that means we can push the level of what is possible. And in that aspect as well, sorry, international solidarity is important, because in the time of crisis like the pandemic and also the climate crisis, the safety of all, or safety of everyone, is important. I mean, if the least, the most marginalized is safe, then everyone will be safe. And this is a principle also mentioned by Martin Luther King when he mentioned that an injustice in a place should be seen as injustice everywhere. It goes to that level as well. But in maybe lastly, what I will say is that we still have a lot of fights in the climate front. Excuse me, water. Also, in terms of we could not solve that fight as well if we continue draining our budget to pay our foreign debts. So that is also a fact that we have to fight for the cancellation of the debts of the Global South, so that we can, it's not just about not paying the money, but also it also means more freedom for our economists to use policies to run the economy. And at the same time, when it comes to where the budget, freeing the budget instead of being drained out and go to the rich countries, it will go to our basic services. So I think it is always important to consider solidarity in that as well, and that all of us are together in all those fights.
So I think, Trump's racism and toxicity and polarization has also caught up with him in the context of the George Floyd moment and so on, and the kind of explosive pushback in American society, but it hasn't stopped at the borders of the United States. It's become, if you like, almost an international or global phenomenon. It's of world historical significance. Despite COVID-19, people are marching on the streets of Australia and Germany, etc., UK, and so on. Even here, we've had some protest action. And I think this is very, very important. But again, we've got to be able to take this to another level. The United States is centrally implicated in, if you like, the ecocidal logic of capitalism and the threat to all of us. And we've got to try and make the leap in internationalism to also connect its carbon criminality to internationalism. This is a very, very important issue. So the carbon criminality of our times, generated by US fracking, etc., also impacts ultimately disproportionately on Black lives, both in the United States, but also globally in the global South. And I think this is the kind of inflection that we need as well, so that we also start talking, isolating Trump's America and the ruling elites, particularly the carbon elites in the world. This is the direction for me that internationalism has to take. There are interesting flowering developments. We're seeing some re-emergence of the World Social Forum processes. We are seeing some interesting developments around what is called DIM 25. We are seeing the emergence of a fifth international inspired by Samir Amin, an eco-socialist international. These are very, very important forces. And particularly if we're going to de-financialize our economies coming out of COVID-19, these kinds of global solidarities are going to be very, very important. Thank you.
Yes, I agree with that, absolutely. If I have to say that the global concept of money is very problematic because essentially, to me, money is fiction. It's nothing real. It's just a story. In those days, they used to write on the notes, this central bank promises to pay. They were not paying nothing. They just made a promise and you carry the paper around, making exchange it for goods. So we really need to look at what the true value of things, and true value of things is not the monetary value. This is why the concepts that are driving policies in the world today are creating more problems for us. Concepts like green economy, putting the nature on the market shelf, and if counting how much pollination, how much was the monetary value of butterflies pollinating plants, and all this, what was the ecosystem service of a river, and how was the monetary value of that. And now we're hearing about, there's also talk about the blue economy, which will lead to, as that expands, will lead to partitioning the oceans and our water bodies and locking out community people and people who depend on these resources, because we have commercialized every part of the seas and the oceans, just as we are grabbing the sky threatening to grab the sky through geoengineering. So everywhere we're seeing a desecration of all that is natural, all that supports life, basically for profit, not really to tackle global warming, not for climate justice. So the best value for climate justice really is to halt all those damaging actions at source. Stop the oil from being extracted, stop the gas, stop the coal. Let's learn how to live again. Living with nature is nothing, it's not, we're not worse off living with nature. We've learned to live with nature the past few months. And a lot of people are enjoying that rather than just always staying so far apart. So coming again to the rights of nature, of course, includes Earth's jurisprudence. There's been a lot of literature on that being developed on that, a lot of conversations being going on that. And really, truly, if you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you really want to take it to the level that it should be. It should actually be a part of the Declaration of the Rights of Nature, because you cannot say you are protecting my right when you are damaging the basis of my life, when you are you are creating climate crisis for me. So we need to rethink a lot of things. There'll be some good things over the years, but this is a point in time where we really need to sit down and rethink. Where is the pathways to the future? What kind of future are we looking at? Are we looking at a situation where certain people are condemned to suffer negative impacts of other people's action? What's the value of capital accumulation for what purpose? So these are the things I believe that we truly need to clearly re-examine. It used to be said that the best things in life are free, but now we know you have to pay for oxygen if you have COVID-19. And if you don't have it, it's a big problem. So we have a reason to re-examine so many things and be sure that what is truly free and what is truly valuable is available to everybody.
Thank you so much. And I would now like to just ask for final thoughts from our three panelists before I hand over to the next panel. And you may begin in any order.
You're very generous. Well, let me just say that in terms of learning from the pandemic and climate justice, we must overcome fear and don't allow the pandemic to make us panic. It's a time for sober reflections, and it's a time to ask strong, big, deep questions. We've been pushed into a corner by a narrative that is increasingly becoming more complex and less valid by the day. So we need to look at what it means to live with nature, what it means to live within limits, and what it means to live in a true spirit of solidarity. Solidarity, somebody said, is love demonstrated on the streets. And I believe this is what would happen that would drive us to a future that we want, is a future of love, not a future of hate, a future of equality, not inequality, a future in which politicians and leaders respect the grassroots and respect the vote, where the ballot actually counts. I hope that happens in my country.
I think I would like to connect what seems to be a global protest against inequality as well. It is quite striking that in the US, people are saying we can't breathe because knees are on our neck. And if we come to think of it, many of the developing countries could not breathe because transnational corporations, international financial institutions are on our neck. So in addressing the crisis, we have to push those knees on our neck so that we can start breathing. We can start the real process of decolonization, because those impositions in our economy is making us still a recolonized country through our policies, through our priorities. And in that aspect, we do need our governments that share our values, that share the kind of economy we want and the kind of future, the kind of environment that we want. So this is really not, climate is not a midterm issue, it's a now issue. And then we have to push for it now as well.
Somebody in the 19th century talking about an alternative society said we must strive for a positive humanism. which means that it must be a humanism that's a naturalism and a naturalism that's a humanism. Translated politically in everyday activism, it means what this panel has been saying: solidarity with human beings and with nature. That's the crucial challenge.